So our next speaker is Tom Getz. He's a weed ecology and cropping systems advisor in UCCE Lassen, Modoc, Plumas, and Sierra counties. Sorry for the mispronunciation there. Tom, okay, you're ready to go.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the introduction, Whitney, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. Hopefully everybody can hear me all right. A lot of good talks so far, and I've learned a lot and excited to be here. I'm going to be talking about a different portion of the state, the area that I work in the Intermountain Region, and I'm going to be talking about specifically managing invasive annual grasses. So let's see here if it's going to let me change slides or if it's not going to let me change slides. Okay, sorry about that. So I'm just going to get into a little bit of background information about the ecotypes in the Intermountain Region, highlight the 3 invasive annual grasses that we deal with a bit and how they interact with fire, talk a little bit about sage grouse, and then get into general management, followed up by some of the recent research that I've been doing with indaziflam. So in terms of the Intermountain area, it's this northern portion of the state, much more similar to the Intermountain West, generally throughout. It's a very interesting region where the Cascades meet the Sierra Nevada, and you have the Modoc Plateau. A bunch of different vegetation types, some brush-dominated landscapes, bitterbrush, lots of sagebrush and juniper, lots of forested pine ecosystems. And unlike some other portions of the state, the desirable grass species, both for livestock and land managers, are perennial bunch grasses. And really in all of these ecosystems, historically there used to be spaces between fuels, which is really where winter annual grasses come into play. These grasses germinate with the first spring rains and are very competitive and provide very fine fuels that really drive fire within these ecosystems. So the first grass I want to talk about is cheatgrass, very widespread throughout California and really widespread throughout the western United States. It's estimated there's over 100 million acres infested with cheatgrass. Winter annual, and it's named cheatgrass because it germinates and grows throughout the winter season, but then is able to capture nutrients and resources that would have been used by those perennial species, and it dries out really before any of those perennial species get going in the spring. Another invasive annual that is much more dominant on some of our heavy clay sorts of soils and quite widespread throughout California, already been mentioned quite a few times today, is medusa head. Much later maturing annual grass species, but very competitive and really has the ability to carry fire as well. And then one that is much more, I believe, on people's radar up in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho is Ventonata, or North African wiregrass. Looking at the CalFlora map, it's not nearly as widespread within California, but I think that this map might not be as representative. I didn't know how to identify this grass when I first got here to the state, and I put 5 or 6 dots on this map. I see it growing lots of different places where both cheatgrass and medusa head grow. And from talking to some of the people up in Washington and Oregon, they actually are seeing this grass start to take over and outcompete rangelands that are dominated currently with medusa head and cheatgrass. Quick shout out in terms of trying to identify these different grasses, which can always be difficult in the seedling stages. Wyoming put together a great management guide, just Wyoming's Invasive Grass Quick Guide, that allows you to walk through and look at some of these different grasses graphically. So what sort of impacts do these grasses have? Well, first and foremost, they really have the ability to create monocultures, crowding out more desirable species. And in terms of, this talk, that jumped ahead on me, they really have the ability to increase fire frequencies and fire regimes connecting fuels. Many of these ecosystems were adapted with fire, but they were adapted with fire at small scale, patchy sorts of fires that burned, occasionally. with these fine fuels and these invasive winter annual grasses that have the ability to grow within all of these ecotypes, fire regimes have increased dramatically, where you have fine, flashy fuels that really can increase the amount of fire on the landscape and really increase the size of the fires that occur. Specifically connecting some of these perennial vegetation types that historically didn't have fire between them to connect them for large-scale burning. So I stole this picture from a trip out to the Santa Rosa Range in Nevada, but it looks very similar to many sites in eastern Lassen County, where we have a low sagebrush system with lots of perennial grasses here, but you can see there's a lot of bare ground. There's not a lot of fuel between those vegetation types to carry fuel. Where, you know, the invasive annual grasses come in, they provide that fuel. Here's a picture of some sheepgrass all dried out in the wintertime. And here's a picture of a low sagebrush ecosystem completely invaded by sheepgrass and medusa head, where it's a continuous fuel blanket between those perennial shrubs. Sagebrush does not resprout, juniper does not resprout, and when you have a fire come through, those invasive annuals are able to carry that fire and really torch those perennial components of the ecosystem that don't come back. Here's a picture of a mountainside and an old fire scar. So the top of the mountain burned, and essentially it just came back with some perennial grasses, but mainly invasive annuals, where all of this blue sagebrush is an area that didn't burn. Historically, this mountain would have been covered in sagebrush, but after the fire, the invasive annuals are too competitive, and they are what comes back in the system. This is, similar for some of the juniper systems, heavily invaded by invasive annual grasses. Here's a picture of the gold fire up in Lassen County right after ignition this past year in 2020. Just getting started, burning pretty heavily in some juniper woodlands fueled by the invasive annuals. And here's a picture of a fire in a mixed conifer stand. And you can't really see it very well, but over here in the corner where you get this little bit of a fire line, those are a bunch of invasive annuals that are fueling this fire and driving it within this system. So they really do have the ability to carry fire. And if you don't have other things, in the seed bank coming back, they really have the ability to create these dense monocultures after fire or multiple fires have occurred. We've had a lot of fire, throughout the past 50 years, and the dynamics of our fire have changed with the historic fire suppression that we've had. This is a graphic that I stole from Janine Little, looking at fire history in both Lassen and Modoc counties. But just to highlight, the historic fire season that we had here in 2020, within the counties that I worked in, we had about 680,000 acres burn, a lot of that in the Bear Fire. But some of these other fires were really heavily dominated by invasive annual grasses. The Caldwell Fire, the W5 Cold Springs Fire, the Gold Fire, and the Loyalton Fire. These were all, driven by some of those invasive annual grasses that I've been talking about. And one thing that I'd like to mention, and one of the big proponents or why people are trying to manage invasive annual grasses besides reducing fire risk, is because of, their impacts on some of our native species. There's a lot of money and funding right now when it comes to sage grouse, which is a bird that's on the brink of being on the threatened list, but there's a lot of money and funding going into protecting its habitat. The sagebrush communities that it lives in, which are present in northeastern California and on the eastern Sierra, are rapidly deteriorating because of these fires. The invasive annuals are able to connect those fuel sources, and you can have stand replacing fires, reducing the habitat for the sage grouse, which depend on the sagebrush for both food as well as cover. And then they also depend on annual species for seeds that are really heavily outcompeted by the invasive annuals. So, millions and millions of acres are currently infested and overtaken by these invasive annuals. There's a lot of money and funding and work going into protecting key habitat, for species like the sage grouse, by creating green strips and fuel breaks to keep areas that haven't burned from burning. Really an interesting looking bird. They're pretty cool, especially in their mating ceremonies. Here's a male in a lek. And so now shifting gears a little bit to, more management of these invasive annual grasses, I wanted to highlight two resources. One that's already been talked about quite a bit, the weed control in natural areas of the Western United States, and another resource from Guy Kaiser and Joe DiTomaso, as well as others, looking at Medusa head management. Both of these are excellent resources, and a lot of the general information I'll be sharing today is coming from these two resources. I highly encourage you to look them up. So in terms of, how can you manage these invasive annual grasses on the landscape, specifically to create some of these fuel breaks to keep some of these areas from burning that haven't burned yet. And, in terms of mechanical techniques, theoretically, you can definitely hand pull annual grasses in, agricultural systems. Tillage can be quite effective, for an individual year of control. But on rangeland systems, a lot of which it look like this, lots of volcanic rock, there really isn't an effective or realistic way to go after these annual grasses with mechanical means, even though theoretically they could be effective. Fire in these perennial dominated ecosystems at these higher elevations, fire can be a great way to suppress some of these invasive annuals, like we've heard in other presentations at lower elevations. Typically in our perennial dominated systems in the Intermountain region, fire just is a self-perpetuating cycle that increases invasive annual grass domination on the landscape. But there is one proponent of fire that I think really fits in place with an integrated pest management approach, is it has the ability to reduce thatch layers on site or reduce the amount of invasive annual grass cover for an individual year, which can be a great opportunity to come in and do some seedings, or a great opportunity to make some herbicide applications, herbicides that might be affected and tied up in that thatch layer. So if you have a fire, it definitely can be a good opportunity to strike and try to get something more desirable on site. In terms of grazing, there has been quite a bit of work looking at high intensity and short duration grazing for suppression of some of these annual grass species. But generally on the landscape scale, it's not something that land managers are typically using. But again, it can be quite effective in combination with herbicides for reducing some of those thatch layers. And then biological, everybody loves biological control. I'm sure some of you have heard about some of the weed suppressive bacteria work that was done by Ann Kennedy up in Washington. Looking at those bacteria that was inhibiting weed growth in some of these invasive annual species. And well, it looked really good in the lab, to my understanding, and following up with a lot of scientists who have been trying to replicate that work in the field. The short answer is no, they haven't been able to get good control at the field level with some of these suppressive bacteria. This is a publication put out just this year by the USGS, I believe, out of Oregon, detailing some of the work that they've been doing with bacteria. And unfortunately, there are not a lot of biological control options available for these grasses. So land managers are really tasked with controlling these species and often rely upon herbicides for control. I'm just going to run through a couple of classes of herbicides and point out, some pros and cons. The ACC ACE inhibitors are the grass killers, clethodim and flazofop. Typically, these are not for range in natural areas, although they can be very effective as a post-emergent treatment for annual grasses. However, they kill desirable grasses as well. But if you look up the labels, there are some certain supplemental labels in certain situations where you might be able to use them in some of those range in natural areas. Glyphosate, well, being a broad spectrum herbicide and being very effective, is non-selective. However, if you use it in the Intermountain region during the dormant season, that timing of application can actually give you some selectivity. Making applications in the late winter after those winter annual grasses have germinated and started to grow, but before those perennials are actively growing, you can make applications of glyphosate over the top of those dormant perennials and control a lot of those invasive annuals. There's been some interesting work done there. Two products that people often rely upon for one good season of control are the pre-emergent products in the sulfonylurea family, rimsulfuron matrix or sulfometron oust. And these products can be applied in typically the best applications are in the fall. right after the annual grasses have germinated, or ideally before germination has occurred. And generally, you can get pretty good perennial grass safety as long as those perennial grasses are not, actively growing. Outside of California, I just want to mention a Mazapic because this is definitely the standard for Medusa head, cheatgrass, and Ventonata control outside of the state. And it's similar to the sulfonylureas in terms of you can get 1 year of control, but unfortunately, it's not labeled here in the state of California. And more recently, there's been a lot of really interesting work being done with aminopyrrolate or milestone, the PGR herbicide. There's been some work done by Guy Kaiser and Josh Davey looking at pre-emergent treatments of really high rates. And, at the spot rate, they've shown really effective control at some of their lower elevation sites. At some of my trials, I didn't have as good a control with these pre-emergent treatments. But what I think is more promising and really interesting to me is some of the work done by Matt Ranella, Josh Davey, Guy Kaiser, and Badzi Majirai, looking at boot stage applications of aminopyrrolate to Medusa head. So essentially, when that seed head is in development in the sheath of the grass, making applications of low rates of aminopyrrolate have been shown to offer seed head sterilization. So in a short-lived species like Medusa head, where you don't have a long seed bank, sterilizing the seed production for multiple years in a row eventually should shift that community to something not dominated by those invasive annuals. And I did put out a demonstration trial just because a bunch of folks were interested in the Intermountain region. They hadn't seen it done. And this picture, all this purple area, was area that was treated with different rates of milestone or aminopyrrolate. Here's an untreated check. In terms of what the grasses looked like all zoomed up, where we made treatments, we were getting a lot of purpling, and we didn't appear to have a lot of seeds being produced. Where in the untreated, the Medusa head was quite nice, white, and very healthy. And a quick and dirty seed germination analysis that I did showed that we had about 90–95% germination of the seeds in the untreated check, where we had very little germination in the areas that have been treated with that aminopyrrolate at the boot stage for Medusa head. So replicating what those others have done, and really interesting, promising work. Wanted to end with and just show some pictures from some of the work that I've been doing with indaziflam, or a tree and vine herbicide. As many may know, if you own any trees, marketed under the trade name Allion. But in the non-crop market, it's marketed as Esplanade. And more recently, outside of California, it has gotten a grazing label, and eventually the company is going to try to market it in California under the trade name Rejuvra. But at this point, it can't be used in grazed areas. But this is a seedling germination inhibitor that's put on before any of those winter annual grasses germinate, and it's shown to be very effective. Some of the work done in Colorado, started back in 2015 with Derek Sebastian, where they made applications of Esplanade to areas that were infested with cheatgrass. And here's a picture of a non-treated area with cheatgrass. And then this is the area that they treated 2 years out. And essentially what they were able to do is get 95% control of that cheatgrass with a single application, really releasing desirable perennials that were already established on site. And I believe that this is where the biggest fit for this product might be, is where you already have some desirable perennials established on site. And as they continued to follow these trials, they were seeing 3, even 4 years of cheatgrass suppression with a single application. So I just wanted to walk through and show some pictures from a few trials that I had up in the Intermountain region. I had some treatments that were put out as pre-emergent treatments in the fall of 2016, some that were put out as early post-emergent treatments at a more degraded site, and then an area that we were trying to come through in seed to see if you could get something growing through the places where the herbicide had been sprayed. So in one of the pre-emergent sites that I had, we had a good stand of perennial grasses. This is a picture of one of the other herbicide treatments tested, Panoramic or a Mazapic, where we weren't getting very good control. Where with our Esplanade or indaziflam application, we were getting excellent control. Really opening up the inner spaces between these perennial grasses and controlling the Medusa head between them. So 2 years after treatment, the untreated checks still look like a nice mat of Medusa head, where that Esplanade application 2 years after application was still keeping excellent control, releasing some of those perennial grasses. 3 years out in 2019, unfortunately, the electric fence went down. And so here's where it was untreated. And here where it was treated. So didn't get any data off of this site, but we were still getting a good suppression in some of these treatments. So like the work that's been done in Washington and Colorado, it seems like there really is some good perennial safety, although, you know, certain perennials might be sensitive, and really excellent control of medusa head here in California. And other states have shown excellent control of cheatgrass and ventonata, much longer than some of those other herbicides that are currently on the market. But lots of our sites in the Intermountain region look more like this, really dominated by some of the invasive annuals, and there's not a lot of desirables left. So here's a picture of some plots that I had. Again, these were put out early post-emergent. Matrix giving pretty good suppression. Esplanade looking absolutely lights out, 7 months out. 18 months out or 2 years after treatment. The industry standard outside of California, plateau or Mazapic, had really started to break. Esplanade was essentially providing bare ground in this treatment 2 years after application, with a couple of non-desirable weeds coming in. 3 years out, those other herbicides didn't look like we had even sprayed them, where some of our treatments of Esplanade 3 years out were starting to break and getting some medusa head coming in, where other treatments essentially were giving us still 95% bare ground, which is not that scary on a 10 by 20 foot plot. But if you were to treat a couple hundred acres where you didn't have any desirable remnant plant community there, it could be a really scary sort of proposition if you weren't able to get something to come back. So that was the last trial that we looked at, where we were trying to seed into some of these areas. And we had some applications that were put out where we wanted to see if we could drill seed into the residue. Broadcast seeding probably wouldn't work, but if we could drill seed down through that layer, we might have some success. 2 years after treatment, essentially only Esplanade was giving us any control. The other treatments that gave us suppression initially 1 year out were not. Just a picture of the site 2 months after treatment, lots of bare ground. The first seeding that we did 1 year after treatment, we didn't get any precipitation, so we didn't get any germination, as is often the case with dryland seedings. You don't get rain, you don't get establishment. Where in our second seeding, we came in 2 years after the initial treatments, and we drill seeded into the plots a bunch of different grasses. And we didn't have success of all of the grasses that we seeded, but we had success of a couple of the grasses. We had good germination and establishment of intermediate wheatgrass, as well as a western wheatgrass, essentially only where we had bare ground or where we were getting control of that those invasive annuals. Where we had other weeds like red stem filari come in, we didn't get establishment, and where we didn't control the medusa head, we didn't get establishment either. So 38 months after application, 3 years and after treatment, you know, lots of our treatments were looking really good, and we had some established desirable perennials coming back, where in some of our other treatments, they were on these small plot scales really starting to be reinvaded. But with this indaziflam treatment, and like they've seen in other states, I think there's a lot of potential to control these invasive annuals where you already have perennials established. This is a picture of a site where a land manager trying to protect some sage-grouse habitat made a large-scale aerial application. And here in the foreground, you can see all these desirable perennial species with a bunch of dead medusa head 1 year after treatment, where this whole back part of it is all dominated by that invasive annual that would really carry fire. You know, fire is not going to carry through a system like this nearly as readily as it's going to carry through a system like this. And just to show you a picture, another picture from the air, this is a picture of that treated strip 1 year after application, where they were able to get really good control and create a fire break to hopefully protect some sagebrush and protect some sage-grouse habitat. And with that, I think I went over what I should have, but I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Tom. You have one question in the Q&A. Is Esplanade effective on yellow star thistle as a pre-emergent treatment?
That is a good question. I'm not sure if Esplanade would be effective on yellow star thistle. That's something I could certainly look into, but off the top of my head, I know it's effective on a lot of annual species, but I'm not sure if yellow star thistle is one that's on the label or not.
Okay, thank you. Oh, one more popped up. Collateral damage to native annual forbs with Esplanade.
That is a really excellent question. there is certainly a lot of potential for collateral damage to any sort of annual species. We did, in some of the work that I've done, I've had a lot of various annual species come up in the plots, but more of them are weedy, or I consider red stem filariae more of a weedy species. Prickly lettuce seems to be quite tolerant of esplanade and came up in quite a few of the plots. I did have some wild sunflowers come up that next year after treatment, but there is a lot of potential, and there just isn't enough research at this point to really determine what species are tolerant or not tolerant, especially when it comes to those annuals versus perennials.
Okay, I went ahead and launched the poll. So if there are additional questions, Tom, if you wouldn't mind answering them, typing into the Q&A, that would be appreciated.
No problem, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you. We'll give you a second to address the poll question answers here in a moment. Give everybody a minute or two here. Okay, about 10 more seconds to vote. Remember, these doesn't matter if you get them right or wrong. Okay, Tom, if you wouldn't mind addressing can you see the
Yeah,
questions?
I can see
okay.
the poll. It looks like 98% got the first one right. Invasive annual species, such as the three I mentioned, really have the ability to carry fire. Didn't make these questions very hard. Esplanade did seem to be effective for medusa head control, as well as cheatgrass and ventonata control. And then 93% got right that sage grouse is the bird's habitat that has been threatened. So very well done.
Okay, thank you, Tom.